Good afternoon, everyone. I am Cyril. I am the chair of the board of EPD Australasia. I've got a great pleasure today to introduce our team of experts for this very specific webinar dedicated to modeling supplementary cementitious materials in EPDs. So we have received a number of feedback and questions around that particular area fundamental to modeling EPDs for concrete and concrete products. And we've decided to bring the experts around the room. You'll hear from them all. And I really invite you to use the Q&A function of this webinar to ask the questions that you may have necessary. So we've got around the room Kelly, who's our CEO, who's going to give a little bit of background. And then we've got Andrew and Rob, who are going to go in a lot more detail about these changes. Thank you. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Cyril. Thanks, everyone, for coming to the webinar today. For those that I haven't met, I'm Kelly Taylor and I'm the CEO of EPD Australasia. So it's my pleasure to be here today and just give a little bit of background before we kick into this very specific topic that we're here for. So we have received a number of questions and comments around this issue, and we're hoping that we can assist in explaining the new requirements and maybe making some progress on an acceptable way forward so that we can continue to provide good environmental data through EPDs. So I'm not a technical person, but really pleased to be followed today by Andrew and Rob, who are experts in this area. So just starting off with a very brief background from me. So talking about reasons why we have these changes to the construction products PCR update, and then Andrew's going to take us through what those key changes are. And then we're hoping to have a good amount of time at the end for question and answers on discussing how we can practically apply these changes and get your feedback on how we can provide some clearer guidance so that we are providing a consistent approach to this issue. So EPD Australasia as an organisation, we're owned by the Life Cycle Associations of Australia and New Zealand. We've been operating for over 10 years. We operate as a regional hub of EPD International, and so our program rules are what we would like to think is internationally harmonised. We're an EPD program operator, which is what is defined in the ISO standard that defines EPDs. So EPDs, EPD program operators, are defined in that ISO standard 14025. And we also operate for construction products under the EN standard 15804. Importantly, we are members of the Eco Platform organisation. Now, that is an industry body, if you like, for EPD programs and a QA body for EPD programs. And they have been working over the last few years really trying to harmonise program rules for EPDs so that we have a consistent approach to EPDs globally. So our sort of key values are quality, consistency, transparency, and that's what we're working towards with that in mind in whatever we do. What we've seen in the last few years is a massive increase in interest in EPDs and growth in EPD numbers and companies developing EPDs has been exponential. And with growth comes greater critique of EPDs and therefore this really strong drive to harmonise program rules, and always through the Eco Platform Industry Association, always questioning best practice and trying to build that into the program rules. So if you look at the program rules, there's what we call a hierarchy of standards. So what we're talking about today is the PCR and the CPCR, but there are all these other things, if we start at the bottom, that feed into that final document. So as I said, ISO 14025 defines EPDs and program operators, what we are. That says we need to develop our own program rules. So that's our general program instructions. We then build in other standards that are relevant to that for example, EN 15804. The next layer you see is those eco-platform standards, and that's that industry body really working to harmonise those program rules, which feeds down to the PCR. Next slide, thanks. So I guess just context that there are many, many influences on program rules that are outside, I guess, our region and our control, but are really important for standardisation of EPDs. So there are the international regional standards, but there's also a strong movement, particularly in the EU, for using EPD data within regulations, and that's driving a lot of this change that we are seeing. So you'll see from this slide, there's many things feeding into the program rules. And if you came to our webinar on the recent change to the construction product PCR, you would have seen this slide as well. So that's a little bit of background, hopefully setting the scene. And I'd like to hand over now to Andrew, who's going to go through in more detail of the SCM issue for you. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Kelly. Steve, can we go to the next one? Thank you. So why are we discussing this issue? Firstly, supplementary cementitious materials are increasingly being used to reduce the embodied environmental impact of products. And examples of SCMs are fly ash, blast furnace slag, and silica fume. There's obviously a lot more materials that can be used as well in the pozzolan family, but these are the three key ones that are commonly used in cement and concrete products. So when it comes to producing a concrete EPD, the best data sources you can use for modelling and producing that concrete EPD would be to use upstream EPDs for all of the products that go into the concrete. So ideally, you'd have a cement EPD, you'd have an EPD for your aggregate, and you'd also have an EPD for the supplementary cementitious material. So at the moment, in Australasia, there's definitely a lot more EPDs of cement products and aggregates, but the supplementary cementitious material area is something where we don't yet have EPDs for everything. So we're definitely moving towards a market where we will literally have EPDs of everything, but it's a case of how do we manage this transition while we don't have that primary collected data representing products at this stage. So as Kelly mentioned, we're part of the Eco Platform. That's why there's the Eco Platform logos that go on our EPDs. And part of that harmonisation, they brought out changes to their rules in December last year that were then incorporated into the new product category rules, of which cement and concrete are part of. And in those Eco Platform LCA rules, they've included specific guidance for supplementary cementitious materials. So they want to understand the impact of SCMs, even if they are small. And at this stage, for many of them, if there's, say, fly ash that's being collected at the power station, it may have very low downstream processing impacts compared to, say, if you're going to the tailings pond and having to dig it up and process it. So at this stage, we want to make sure that the environmental impact of the SCMs is included so that it's as representative as possible. So for co-products, just before we go to that slide, Steve, the final point there is that where the economic value of co-products was very low, so 1%, previously they could be neglected, but now with the new rules, they're saying that they need to be included even if they are small. if we go on to the co-product allocation slide to give a very basic breakdown of what we're talking about with co-product allocation. So if we look at an electricity production process, the primary reason why we're producing electricity at the power stations is for the electricity. And previously the ash products would have been considered to be a waste, but now for many there's a positive economic value associated with those. So we have to divide up the environmental burden of the mining of the coal, the burning of the coal, between the electricity and the ash products. So that's the question of how we do that in a fair way that represents that environmental burden. So in terms of how we do that, the updated PCR has guidance. So ideally we would be using primary data where it is available. So if there is an EPD for the product that you purchase from an upstream supplier, that's great. You can use that EPD to plug straight into the production of your downstream EPD. If they don't have an EPD, but your supplier is willing to provide you the inventory data, that's also great. So they're both considered primary data sources. If the upstream information is not available, that's when we go to secondary data, either from databases or literature. And if there is nothing in literature or databases, then we come down to the proxy data. So this priority is reflected in the new data quality reporting requirements that are now in the new PCR, so that EPD users can see whether the data you're using to represent the SCMs is primary data collected from the manufacturers or suppliers, or whether it's secondary data or proxy data, so that they can make really informed decisions about the EPD data. And next slide. So in terms of EPDs in Australia for supplementary cementitious materials, we've seen 2 be published for blast furnace slag for independent cement and for HR cement. They've been published recently. And so they are representative of those products. And then if we go on to the international EPD market, the next slide. There's also EPDs been published for fly ash in different markets, and there's also a silica fume EPD that's been published for China. So these give us an idea of what the environmental impacts associated with those products are. And increasingly, we'll be using more of these upstream EPDs. So if your suppliers don't have EPD data at the moment, this is a great time to request that information from them, so that you can model it as accurately as possible in your downstream EPD. Next slide. So we have the technical advisory group of EPD Australasia has put together some draft guidance on the economic allocation for supplementary cementitious materials. This paper goes through the background of everything that's being presented here while we're doing it, but in quite a lot more detail, and also provide some context. So this table here shows the EPDs that have been currently published, what their EPD numbers are, an idea of the total global warming potential per tonne, and the geographic scope of those EPDs. So we can get an idea of what the figures are looking like for these supplementary cementitious materials. So a lot of the figures are very specific to what co-product is being collected and what the downstream processing of that product is required, and also how it's been allocated economically from the primary producing process. Next slide. So these factors have been proposed to be used as economic allocation factors in the absence of any other information. So it's based on a paper that was published by the Cement, Concrete and Aggregate Association of Australia. So that was published in a journal paper that was peer reviewed, and they came up with co-product allocation factors based on economic allocation. So for the fly ash, it was around 1.6% of electricity production impact should be associated or allocated to the fly ash. Blast furnace slag, they came up with 5.1%, and silica fume 16%. So based on the information in the literature review we've done, these factors are quite conservative. So these could be used for the economic allocation if there's no other information available from your upstream suppliers. If we go into more detail, I spent quite a bit of time trying to check those factors to see if we looked at more recent data, because the CCAA paper was from 2017 and obviously prices change. And when I say prices here, there's a difference between the market price of a product such as fly ash. That's not the price that should be used for the allocation, the economic allocation. The economic allocation factor should be what the fly ash producer is paying the coal-fired power station for that ash. So that's where it is really challenging to get access to that data, because it's often commercial in confidence, which is why it's often much easier to get access to that information if you're producing an EPD, or those fly ash producers are producing an EPD themselves, rather than trying to get access it without having those commercial relationships. So if we went through a scenario looking at the 5-year average wholesale price of electricity for New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, excluding 2022, because the wholesale price of electricity was really high during that period, like way off the normal trend. And we assume a fly ash price that the fly ash producers, SCM producers pay of say $50 a tonne, and the ash percentage that's produced per megawatt hour is around 20 kilos. And the share of that ash, which is actually fly ash versus other types of ash, being around 70%, then you come up with an allocation factor of just less than 1%, so 0.9% of the coal-fired power generation. So that's also another factor that could be used given all of those assumptions. So this is where the LCA consultants, if they have access to better information, like they may know the exact price, it may not be $50 a tonne, it might be $20 a tonne or 10 or 0. That can be all included in the LCA background report that then goes to the verifier to check all those assumptions when it comes to producing the final results that go into the EPD. Next slide. So while doing all of this research on SCMs, it became pretty apparent that we really need to be clear that after the point of allocation of the fly ash being collected from the power station, we do need to make sure all of the other steps are being included in the modelling of those products in the EPD. So if the fly ash is collected dry and it's comes through the electrostatic precipitators and is caught in the bag house and then put in a silo, there's very little additional processing associated with that. There could be some classification, like it could go through a cyclone. There could be some milling or grinding. There could be carbon reduction if the carbon content is over the Australian standards, so they may have to burn off some of that carbon. There can be further screening steps, blending, packaging, and then the downstream transportation. So when modelling these products during the LCA stage, all of these relevant parts should be included. So at this stage, most of the fly ash that's being used is dry collected from what I can gather. But I'm looking forward to getting feedback from all of you during the Q&A session. As we progress as the coal-fired power stations get shut down, there is a huge amount of fly ash that's been stored in tailings ponds. I think there was something like 250 years worth of fly ash has been stored, but obviously that's in the ground now. That's got to be excavated and go through further processing steps to produce that as an SCM product that would have to be included in the EPDs. When it comes to blast furnace slag, it's really important to make the distinction between blast furnace slag that comes out of the steel mill and the ground granulated blast furnace slag that is produced after it has been dried and gone through the grinding process and had packaging and relevant downstream transport. All of those parts have to be included as well. Just sometimes that grinding and drying occurs upstream of the cement manufacturers. Sometimes it occurs at the cement plant. So depending on what processes and where you're getting your SCMs from, you need to make sure that these relevant parts are included in that modelling. When it comes to silica fume, it's a higher value product that doesn't need much downstream processing other than potentially densification and bagging and the transportation steps. So where to from here? Up next, we've got a Q&A session. So if you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, or you'd like to get involved in the production of this guidance, please send us an email. So that's my technical EPD Australasia email address. Please send through any comments to there, or I'm more than happy to talk to people. So made them foolishly enough to put my own phone number on there, but yep, give me a call. Happy to discuss it. We will be circulating the draft technical guidance that's currently been circulated to the technical advisory group. So it's around 10 pages. Hopefully we can cut that down and make it as brief as possible while still providing good content and guidance. And eventually the guidance will be published on the EPD Australasia website. So it will be a living document that will be updated as needed, but it will, reside on the website there. So now we'll go on to the Q&A session. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Rob Rouette, who is the co-chair of the construction product PCR, and we're lucky enough to have Rob representing EPD Australasia on the International Technical Committee. So he's got a lot of expertise. Most of you know Rob. So he's here to help with the Q&A session. So over to you, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks for summarising all the issues and the potential solutions. It's definitely not a black and white scenario that we have ahead of us. So that is why we're here today, and that is why we really do welcome feedback and comments at this stage. So please do use the Q&A and we can start some discussion. And then, as Andrew said, he is open to having further conversations offline whilst we try and develop this guidance for you. So we've got a couple of questions up there that we can get started with. And as Andrew said, we also have Rob here, which is great to have his expertise online to help with answering the questions. So the first one is really about, so you provided some examples of EPDs for GGBFS. I'm not sure I know off the top of my head what that acronym is. Maybe Andrew can clarify, but just noting that it uses the old PCR and therefore is it relevant?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the allocation factor of what they've used in there should be relevant for those producers. So if they have used economic allocation, which hopefully they have, I haven't reviewed all of these EPDs in detail, but they have access to that economic data to do that economic allocation. So then it would be compatible to plug into the downstream EPDs.
I can add to that because there are a few more EPDs, but they're not as visible. So for boral cementitious and for BGC cementitious EPDs, where these are older EPDs, so they were allowed to have multiple products in a single EPD, hence they don't stand out as particular SCM EPDs, but they do both have a slag product, and slag we refer to slag as GGBFS, the ground granulated blast furnace slag. Now, and yeah, I've worked on both of those, and I also had a look at one of the two that were in the table that you showed, and all three use the same data set, which is the actual AusLCI data set for slag, which does include economic allocation, so it does comply with the current rules. And it's kind of an interesting topic, I think, because, and I sort of had a quick peek at some of the questions, and Johan mentions the problem that we've been running into for the last, I don't know how many years. It's that the suppliers of the material often do not have the necessary information to be able to do the economic allocation correctly. So, for example, a supplier of slag, which or GGBFS, which is often a cement producer as well, they get that material from a steel manufacturer. And I think we've got some representatives on the call as well, and I specifically reached out to them because I think this is important to connect the two industries. So the steel manufacturers, they produce slag as a byproduct, which then gets dried and ground, as Andrew explained, to form GGBFS, which can then go into concrete as a cement replacement. It's a closely guarded secret for the steel industry as to what the actual price of slag is, because it probably varies from customer to customer, and yeah, for also the reasons that that is not publicly communicated figure. So the question, I think, is there a way that they can produce an EPD for their slags, as they've already produced EPDs for their main products, the steel, that does not disclose the actual allocation and the value of the slag, because that's something that, for obvious reasons, they don't want to communicate, but that would allow the rest of the market to use more reasonable data than what we currently have. And I think the AusLCI data are good, but they are getting a bit older. And so they're probably, I think, just over 10 years old now when they were originally produced. So we don't really know whether the market has changed considerably, up or down, either way. We don't have any insights into differences between blast furnace slag, basic oxygen steel slag, and EAF steel slag, and they have different purposes in different markets. So any further information that we can get there would be greatly appreciated and would help all the downstream customers as well. So this is, I guess, a call to the steel manufacturers to see if they can do something there to provide better insights. Just to conclude that, what Andrew just presented is an approach that shows a default. And as Andrew mentioned, we may end up with some conservative figures. If that's the case, it's not going to help anyone in that regards to use more of these products, because the CO2 factors will end up going up and all the environmental impacts will go up. But what we're talking about is to try to get a best estimate as to what these materials should look like, and hence why better information generally tends to lead to better outcomes.
Thanks, Rob. Hopefully, I think you've answered the first part of Johann's question that was in there as well, around not having that data from suppliers. Johann goes on to ask then, if this data isn't available, then should, and my question, I guess, from a technical perspective is, could EPD Australasia introduce mandatory allocation factors to be used?
Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, look, I
You
agree.
understand?
I think, I guess the underlying question sort of related to that is, if the value of a co-product changes, does its environmental impact change? And that becomes more of a philosophical question, right? Because the production process may not change at all. It's purely that the market conditions change and therefore the values change. And that's a problem we always have had in LCA when we look to apply economic allocation. And so the rules often stipulate that you should use data for price data that cover 2 or 3 years, or sometimes 5 years. Well, good luck. You know, the rules can ask for a lot of things, but we know that they often don't exist in the public domain. And then the other question is, well, if the price changes a bit, does that mean that the actual environmental impact should change? I think, in my view, it's more important that we agree on a reasonable value that can stay consistent for some time until there's a real shift in the market. Then we may have to evaluate that and see if we need to update it. But to have constant fluctuations in value and in value ratios between co-products, I don't think it's necessarily helping us. It's not making it more accurate. It's just sort of reflecting what happens on a particular day. And so I completely agree that we should try to mandate this, and sort of beating the drum that I've been beating for some time. I think AusLCI was always intended to do that, but perhaps has not developed into the position that we originally envisaged. And it should, in my view, be the perfect platform for deciding what that value should be that everyone can access. So I think there's still potentially a role for that, and luckily we've been actually using that, and to some point that means that a lot of the EPDs out there, whether it's SCM EPDs or concrete EPDs, already use these values. What we've also seen is that some alternative tools or international tools that are not necessarily connected up with the AusLCI database use different factors, or leave it to the user to determine what factor to use. And that's, I think, where we've seen some discrepancies that we obviously can't control. We can't control what tools are out there, and hence why I think mandating it, whether it's mandating AusLCI data or through the document that's currently being developed, either way I think would be a good way forward, because it creates a level playing field, and I think that's quite important.
Yeah, going back through all the guidance, it was very clear that this topic needed to be addressed. So everyone knows it's an issue. Everyone recommends consistency on factors, but no one has been willing to step up at this stage and come up with some agreed factors. So this is where EPD Australasia are being one of the first to step up and actually do this. So everyone's keenly watching how it's going to go. In my view, the whole point of the program is continuous improvement. So part of that is using the best data available, and over time that does evolve, so that we can make informed decisions. And one thing we definitely don't want to do is provide default factors that discourage the SCM producers to do their own EPDs, because we want to have that accurate primary data, and that's where they do have access to that economic allocation data, and that then it's why we're using EPDs and not publishing raw LTI data. So everyone's secret recipes are all protected, and that's not presented as part of the EPDs, only the results are. So we definitely want to encourage the SCM producers to produce EPDs, which is why the default economic allocation factors, I think, need to be on the conservative side. That then, so if people don't want to do the additional work, because it is a hell of a lot more work to try and source better data, that we have them on the conservative side, and then the people that are willing to put in the extra work to collect the further upstream data to model it more accurately, then that's the reward they get for that extra work.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I think this is a complex issue, and as you say, we have to do the best with what we have at the time, but be aware that this could change over time and not reduce the ability, as you say, or reduce the motivation to get more accurate data in the future as well. So we've got quite a few questions that I want to make sure we get through. So, and I'm hoping you, Andrew and Rob, you can see these as well. So there's one from Gustavo saying some allocation factors are pulled from secondary databases, but you are not recommending to use these values in the presentation. Is this correct, and why?
So the presentation, we haven't presented the whole technical guidance note, which is around 10 pages, including a long list of references. So there's more detail in that. So if Gustavo would like to contribute to drafting of the technical guidance note, yeah, please get in contact. We'd love to have
absolutely
have him on board and that feedback. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Please get in contact if you have specific or general feedback on it. Thanks, Andrew. Lewis has said, I think one of the estimates from Saudi Arabia for fly ash was 106 kilograms CO2 per tonne, and the other two were 16 and 9. What caused the wide range of values?
Yeah, so I did have a quick look into those. In some of them, they had the largest part of the impact was in module A1, and for some it was actually down in module A3, so the manufacturing of the SCMs. So I haven't gone into then further level of detail to go, all right, well, let's go and have a look at where they're actually importing those products from, and what's the specific geographic situation there. Because in some countries where they've got a lot of coal-fired generation, they've got a lot of fly ash products, and it is more considered to be a waste. So the economic allocation factor for that is very low, where others it's higher. So that's where it does come down to the specific circumstances, which is why having EPDs for those specific products is really important.
I did actually have a look into that, into two EPDs, the Saudi Arabian one and an Indian one. And the Saudi Arabian one is actually for fly ash imported from India. And I look for the sort of information in the EPDs that might give me a bit more of an understanding as to what's been going on. And one of the things I noticed that the LCA practitioner was the same person, which usually means that they have used a similar approach across the EPDs, especially if they're produced in a fairly short time frame. Now, what I noticed is that the A1 impacts of the Saudi Arabian EPD were similar to the A1 to A3 impacts of the Indian EPD. Small differences, but very close actually. And A2 and A3 is the shipping of the fly ash to Saudi Arabia. So once you take that out of the equation, you get a better indication of what the actual fly ash factor is. And that was around 65 kilograms a ton. Now, the Indian EPD then broke that down further, because that one actually shows you the allocation, which is, I think, A1 to them, the partial transport to a processing plant that classifies the fly ash and that perhaps dries it as well, I think was part of the explanation. And the A1 impact was, I think, was 6 or 9 kilogram. Maybe it's the number that you put there, Lewis. But that shows you that, yeah, you've got to be quite careful in sort of looking at the numbers, and hence why Andrew is advocating for trying to get accurate numbers. We kind of want to understand, well, what's the allocation factor? So what is the impact of the material as it is generated? And then there is a number of different potential processing steps required, from minimal processing, basically capturing it and putting it in a truck, to packaging, to drying, to, I don't know, there could be a number of other things. I think carbon, burning off the carbon in it could be another one that, yeah, I'm not sure if that even happens in Australia, but sort of looking at literature, it could occur in some places. If these processing steps are required, then we would like to understand it, because that's actually very significant. If you've got two sources of fly ash, one of them is, let's call it, clean and can be used as is, and the other one requires burning off of carbon before it can be used, then that's a material difference between the two materials that should be coming through the numbers. On the other hand, I would also question, well, do we need specific numbers from each coal-fired power plant? Is that a material difference between the plants in how they operate and what sort of value they're getting from their fly ash and their electricity? For example, you might have two plants in one location, let's say in New South Wales, that operate similarly but get a slightly different quality of coal. You could argue that if the ash content of the coal varies, and therefore the economics between the electricity generated and the coal generated, or sorry, the ash generated, will look slightly different. Maybe that's something that we should take into account. Or maybe they actually supply electricity at different times of the day, therefore the way the market works, their revenue from electricity would look different, everything else being the same. We might end up getting to an awful lot of detail that doesn't really reflect the differences between the materials, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's part of the discussion that we should have, to see what level of granularity is really appropriate and will help us be more accurate in our LCAs, and at what point do we overshoot and end up looking for differences that don't necessarily reflect the market, if that makes sense. So I think that's part of the discussion I'm keen on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good to talk through these issues so that everyone understands the potential complexities that can sit behind them. Right, let's crack on. So we do have a lot of questions, and I'd like to be able to answer as many as we can in this session. If we don't get around to answering your question, we will endeavour to do that separately, either by a phone call or by an email. So rest assured, we will get back to you. So Daniel has asked, how relevant is it to use an EPD from a different company or supplier to the one used in your own supply chain? Is there a difference between different fly ash suppliers or power stations? I think you've answered that to some extent. That would make it difficult to use an EPD that wasn't specific for your supply chain. And I think that's, really what we're talking about. If your supplier doesn't have the data, then we need a consistent approach. Is that what we're saying here? I mean, I understand it's a lot more complex than that, but in the absence of good supplier data, we need a consistent approach that everyone can use. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's where when you're preparing the background LCA report that goes to the verifier, you have to justify if you're using an EPD that is not for your upstream product, and you'd have to satisfy the verifier would have to be satisfied with that justification. So yeah, as Rob was describing, for fly ash, there's fly ash and there's fly ash. There's a whole range of different grades. And yeah, it does matter about the efficiency of the power station, how much ash is produced, whether it's coming from brown coal or it's lignite. All these differences can influence the overall results.
Mm.
So you'd have to,
Yeah.
you'd have to justify that to your verifier, and by describing that in the background LCA report.
And I guess in terms of, you set out the data quality, we want to use primary data where we can, and EPDs is the best way, and obviously from your supplier is the best way. But I guess where does an EPD from a different supplier for a similar product sit in that scheme of things? Is that still primary data, or is that secondary data? How valuable is that as opposed to going to a generic factor?
In my view, it would be somewhere between secondary data and proxy data.
Sure.
Probably more in the proxy data camp. So then that data quality would be reflected through in the EPD as well.
Okay. So another question here, I'm talking about slag as an example. The economic allocation should be done on the pig iron, but the pig iron is an interim product within the slag process. Whilst we can get some idea on yield splits, we are unlikely to get to the producer cost for the interim product. Does this mean we end up having to use conservative AusLCI data? Is this going backwards from the material allocation splits?
So yeah, the person's correct in that if you don't have the primary data, you have to always be on the conservative side. So this is where these default factors that we come up with, they will be on the conservative side of the conservative side.
Yeah.
And this is where I perhaps have a slightly different view as to how we can approach this, because I think we want to be conservative but not overly conservative, and especially if there are sort of practical limitations to what can be collected or what can be done. So in this case, where pig iron is the intermediate product that doesn't necessarily have an unspoken value, and knowing there's only 2 producers in Australia, right, we could, for example, go to them and say, with the AusLCI data, and say, well, provide your view on this, put your ruler next to this. Do you think this is a reasonable approach? And I'd be quite happy if we got a good estimate rather than conservative necessarily, given that there's only 2 of them. If, let's say, we estimate it too high, and I don't think the AusLCI data are necessarily overly conservative, I think they're just the best estimate at a time. But if we went to a more conservative value, and I've got no idea what that would add, but let's say that adds 50% to the impact of slag, will that help them to produce their own EPDs? Maybe, or maybe we punish everyone simultaneously. I'm not so sure I've got the answers to that, and I think it's quite complicated. So
yeah,
again,
absolutely.
there's a call to the producers to help us out here, because we only have limited visibility.
Yeah, and maybe there is a role then for the rest of us here to work with the supply chain to develop EPDs and really encourage that, and ask for it through your supply chain processes. Yeah.
And there's lots of different avenues. If the industry want to get together and do an industry average EPD,
Absolutely.
we can definitely do that as well.
Support
so there's
that.
a lot of ways that this can be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
great. So question from Zoe. So the GGBFS example you showed for 164 kilograms per tonne for ICL, whilst representing a previous PCR as possible, close to what was calculated for use previously. I think I understand what that means. The revised calculation we have been provided for the latest PCR is in the region of 240 kilograms, which is significantly higher. If accurate primary data is significantly higher, how do we safeguard against this disadvantage?
That's where I think we have to be on the conservative side of the conservative side, not to be excessive, but we've got this problem where we've got reality, and we've got what the modeling shows us, and we want to get as close to reflecting reality as possible, but at the same time we don't want to flip the market all on its head and produce unexpected outcomes that have adverse environmental impacts. So that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to represent reality as best we can, which is it's a push for more EPDs and more accurate data.
Yeah.
But I also think it's not necessarily, I'd like to understand the differences there, but I don't think it's necessarily a difference between the previous PCR and the current PCR. That 164 kilogram value, I think, is probably based on AusLCI data for the actual slag, which involves the allocation bit. And from memory, that sits in the order of about 50 kilograms CO2. That's at the point of generation. So everything after that, about 100 odd kilograms, is for the drying and the grinding. And that can differ, but based on the data that I've seen from the primary producers, they have that information available, and there will be some differences between the producers based on what fuel do they use for the drying. Is that, excuse me, is it natural gas or coal or something else? So you would expect to see some differences, but if the allocation has changed from, say, 50 to 150 kilogram CO2 per ton, that's not necessarily a PCR thing. That might be a change in literature source. So I'd like to understand what's causing that.
Yeah, so maybe that's something we could look at offline. We are going to run out of time for all questions, so I'd just like to just take time for one more before we wrap up, and then we will endeavour to reply to all the other questions that have come through. I think there'll be maybe 3 or 4 we won't get to. So Dave has asked, given fly ash is a direct impact of the coal sources being used and the de-dusting technologies, how do we practically get the yield results? And there's a sort of related question, I think, that we could maybe, oh gosh, there's so many questions popped up, I can't see it now. Let's address that one. So that's from Dave Darlow.
So,
sorry, the related one also from Dave just says, a lot of SCMs are purchased from abroad. Would AusLCI be able to get the splits from those producers rather than just Australia?
Yeah, this is where if people have contacts that will help us get to that primary data. The other way that we could do this is if the producers are happy to provide confidential data to either to AusLCI or to EPD Australasia, we can then anonymise that, mix it with the other data to get a good representative average to go into this technical guidance. That would be another way to go. So people can definitely provide confidential, information. That's what LCA practitioners do every day. We're, NDAs signed all over the place. So we could maintain that confidentiality by blending it with the other data from other suppliers.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to wrap it up now. Thank you very much for your time and expertise, Andrew and Rob. This is a complex area. EPD Australasia is doing our best to try and decipher some useful technical guidance that will help resolve this. We are seeking feedback now So really, please do get in touch with us, and do get in touch with us as soon as you possibly can to provide some input. We'd like to get this guidance out as soon as possible. Andrew, do we have a timeline for releasing that? We don't want to do it too early until we have everyone's input, but Andrew,
well,
do
no,
you
it's definitely as soon as possible. So in the next couple of weeks, ideally, but let's see how much feedback, because we'd rather do it once and do it properly than have to reissue corrections. So we'll have a look at all of the comments, and if people can get in contact with me today, ideally, then we can incorporate all that feedback as quickly as we can.
Excellent. So if people can try and get to Andrew, definitely, you know, this week, the sooner the better we can get this guidance out and released. It will go up on our website. There is a tab that is there along with the program rules and FAQs, and that's where our technical guidance notes sit as well. Please get in touch if you have trouble accessing that at all. And just before we do finish up today, I just want to let people know that we are running a series of half-day conferences in October, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne, which will give us the opportunity to really connect with people in person. We're going to have some amazing speakers that we'll be announcing shortly, and we're keeping them short and sharp, half day. You can fit it into your week. So we're really hoping to connect with as many people as possible in person through those. So please keep an eye out for registrations for those. They will be opening this week as well. Thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to receiving your input over the next few days. Thanks to our speakers, Andrew and Rob.
Thanks, everyone. Great
Thanks, Kelly.
questions.